Hello, and welcome to the second session of the MIT Open Documentary Lab Talk, and our first in-person session, and also it's hybrid, so bear with us as we learn how to do this. I also wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that the land which we sit on is the unceded territory of the Massachusetts and their neighbors, the Wampanoag and Nipmuc peoples who have stewarded this land for generations. We recognize the repeated violations of sovereignty, territory, and water perpetrated by invaders that have impacted the original inhabitants of this land. We extend our respect to citizens of these nations who live here today and their ancestors who have lived here for many generations. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Marisa Morán Jahn and Rafi Segal, who are here to talk about their work, which explores the power of art and architecture to create new narratives and reimagine urban space, and to create forms and spaces for emerging collective identities, communal self-determination, and a pluralist economy. Marisa Jahn is an artist and transmedia filmmaker of Ecuadorian and Chinese descent, and her works redistribute power and, in the words of ArtForum, exemplify the possibility of art as social practice. You can read more about her and her work in the chat or online if you're here and not on Zoom. Rafi is an architect and associate professor of architecture and urbanism at MIT. His work involves design and research on the architectural, urban, and regional scale, currently focused on how emerging notions of collectivity can impact the design of buildings and cities. You can read more about him as well in the chat or on our website. Before I hand it over to them, I just wanted to say they're going to talk about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. If you're on Zoom, you can put your questions in the Q&A, and we will do our best to get to them. And if you're here in person, just raise your hand. All right, thank you. Without further ado, Rafi and Marisa.
Sarah, I get that. All right, thanks. Yeah?
Yeah.
Do you want to, shall we start?
First, thank you, Sarah and Claudia and Open Doc Lab.
You want to go, or shall I? Well, our first project, which is on now, is at the Venice Architecture Biennale. I need to talk into the mic, right? But can you confirm that I'm being heard on Zoom, right? We'll run a short film describing the installation.
Actually, it should be on mute, so you just speak over it.
Okay, that's intentional?
Yeah.
All right. This is a collaboration between Marisa, myself, and Sarah Williams of Civic Design Lab, and Greg Lindsay, a journalist and writer, which not only explored the possibility of a digital platform, an artist installation, and a physical structure in the context of an architecture biennale, but also launched this initiative that we called Open Collectives, and begins to touch on some of the issues we'll talk about today, about forms of solidarity and the role of art and architecture in creating and also stabilizing these forms. One of the issues, semi-technical, but like in any installation that came up, was how do you meet the physical install structure and the projection, where the physical installation was made of a tilted surface. And then when Marisa was working on her films, we ran into the problem of the projection because the screen was not rectangular, and we're kind of used to projecting rectangular. So it ended up with kind of transforming the way Marisa was thinking about the film and the projections and how the architecture interacted with that. That was the first kind of attempt to begin to negotiate and allow one to influence the other.
So essentially when Rafi's saying that it's not rectangular, it was not a 16:9 or 3:4 ratio, which then requires, if you project onto that screen, then you're going to see the contours of it. So it asks us to rethink how we're going to show this film. And in the way that in the installation, the screen becomes this envelope and this seat, and the slight shift alters how and questions how we think about architecture normally, these plumb and rectilinear spaces. I then was thinking about the film and rethinking, well, what does it mean to not use the convention of the rectangular cinematic space that we're used to? This is the bit of the films I'll share with you.
Agency. We design the world and the world designs us back. Now, if what we have designed is so problematic, the question becomes, can design be reoriented? And I know we have to design things and we have to create dwellings, but the challenge is how do we recreate those dwellings in a way that don't make us more isolated than we already are, but enable reconnections.
Historically, Black women have played a critical role in building the economic solidarity of their communities. We're really not just reacting against things, we're building spaces, activities, and connections for the long run, helping to build a community that extends beyond ourselves, and that is solidarity.
In order to create the common, it's something that's neither public nor private property, but is shared and collectively decided. That requires a design structure.
Building solidarity for workers means building spaces for our communities to flourish and express our values.
Essentially, the 16:9 and 3:4 frame is already a mask. It cuts out, it includes and showcases, and it excludes. And then what does it mean if you make this window or this opening or this aperture different, both architecturally and cinematically? And the other thing about the architectural space is that that I find interesting is that you're pulled into this space and then you're invited to peek behind, and there's this kind of reveal showing you some of the forms that influence this theme about collectivity. So this idea that when we're, in Rafi's work and working with collectives, and in my own work with working families and immigrants, we're making new social structures and we're creating and we're making visible new forms of solidarity. And then how can that be echoed through the design and through the film? And always affirmed that we are making and building these structures and we're showing the reveal in a sense. So prior to this collaboration with Rafi, and this language that we're exploring, in my own work, I have worked a lot with those involved in the informal economy, informal sector. So street vendors, domestic workers, migrant workers. This is with a community in Honduras that invited me to do this bookmaking and literacy workshop, which then to make this literacy initiative stick, we created this character called Bibliobandido, which means story eater. And the legend around this character is that he eats stories And to appease his insatiable appetite, you have to offer him and sacrifice stories. So you're not giving up your story, but you're nourishing him. And it's this allegory for the way in which we're all hungry for stories. But this guy takes it a little bit further. And it's a project that, you know, in this map that you see here, it's now been over 10 years in which it's continued in Honduras. And I've taken it to different libraries and museums in North America. But the point of this project that I want to emphasize that kind of ties back to this language that we're thinking about of art architecture across what we're calling pluri-economies is invoked through this installation at the Sugar Hill Museum of Art and Storytelling. And here, what I wanted to do was create this installation that puts you into the space of this story eater's stomach. And so when you enter into the space, it feels shadowy and intestinal. And, you know, essentially this rope network, this Enneper structure it's a screen that filters in light, right? So you come in and the gallery attendant, the way that they are pulling you into the space is they engage the kid coming in, imagining as if they were in the stomach. And then you can see the video, part of the video that we created. And then in the back wall, well, in the middle here, there's a table where you can make your own book and the gallery attendant can show you how to make it and there's templates. And then there's this third station that says, I'm hungry, tell me your stories. And it's a hole in the wall, like a confessional booth. And you offer your stories and then it's interactive so that when you're there and you're whispering, you can peek through and see this unexpected other space. And when you walk around the corner, you can see that it was created from, this is a sawed-off Nalgene bottle with a salt shaker at the end. And then you see that it's made from this, a record player with just junk glued on it. So this idea that this God that we've made up, it deconstructs itself as well. So I'm interested in this idea of extimacy, which is this, it's not my word, it's Lacan's word, about the mediation of intimacy through a third object, to which I append the mediation of intimacy through a third object, whether that's space, architectural space, or objects, or a ritual, image, or screen. When we're talking about intimacy, sorry, these were queued up to be automatic, but they're not going automatically. So this idea of intimacy with ourselves or with another or with the sacral. So continuing this idea of this space that you crawl through and there's a reveal at the end or there's a reward and this, when I'm using the word cinematic, I'm not only then here referring to just the image on the screen, but also this other experience of light and images. So in this other installation in Kaliningrad, which is a part of Russia, so Kaliningrad is interesting because you see the spit here on the bottom. It's the only port in the Baltic that doesn't freeze over, which means it's an important military space and naval space in particular, which is one of the reasons why it was then conquered over and over and over again. And so there's this overlap that you see in the urban space of these different political regimes. And so now Kaliningrad is part of Russia, and when you're walking through Kaliningrad, you see these matrushka dolls, these dolls within this dolls, kind of nested structure. And then you see these castles, which have been occupied, and it's the first thing that people do when they occupy the spaces. They occupy these different castles and these kind of fortresses, right? So, and everybody wants to see inside because they've been closed off for years. So one of my collaborators, Steve Shade, and I were invited to do this installation in this castle. And what this space is, so part of the experience is queuing up, and this idea of the journey and the experience is part of the journey getting there, and the travail to get the reveal. And so there was lines queued up for this 24-hour festival, day and night. And when you got in, you took off your shoes, as you do in some sacred spaces. And it's, again, pink inside, which is kind of intestinal, but fantastical. And there's this series of small rooms that you then walk through this door. And each time you get through another room, it's smaller and smaller, so that by the end, you are kneeling, not only kneeling, but you're lying flat on your stomach. And then when you finally get to the end space, you feel that you're in the middle of this castle, and there's a smoke machine. And oops. This is the flight of the bumblebee. And so we are like lying prostrate, and then you hear this sound, you know, you can't see anything. It's kind of foggy, and there's these lights. And then it's as if you're being mocked. You're being mocked, and then you have to believe, you have to get up and retrace your footsteps. So I'm interested in this idea of believing as if, and this idea of how the way in which we create these institutions, which, you know, different people talk about the structure of believing as if, which can be convenient to believe in Santa Claus or in a religion, or it offers certain social rewards, or, you know, this idea of believing just in case, or believing, which is also, it still offers, as Zizek points out, it offers you this transformation, even though you may know that it is constructed, you still are transformed nonetheless. So in the final example that I'll share before I segue over, again, this idea of, for this I was asked to do a performance, and then the pandemic broke, and I had to do something in my own home, or took up a challenge. And I thought, well, what does it mean to make a theatrical space, one's own space? So here you see me making it up, right? In the way that there's always this reveal that I'm interested in providing. So here I'm pretending as if it's a peep show, and you are made to feel like perhaps you shouldn't be, it feels very intimate, right? And this idea also of the touching of the screen or touching of the mirror. Second clip. It's supposed to feel like you're in this peep show or this can. These are clips from Busby Berkeley's shows. So, right, so I'm interested in the way that architecture and film can ask us to enact and embody and perform this belief structure, or further, this believing as if. So should we switch?
Right, yeah, I can stay here.
Well, here, let's switch, because I feel like you have a lot of slides
Moving
to
around.
go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Slides. Good. Can I, am I heard? Super. Right. Wonderful work, by the way.
Thanks.
I'll present a few of my designs, my design work. And after you've seen kind of artwork or Marisa's work, where she's coming from, try to touch or explain what the potential is of a collaboration and why we see the value in it, and kind of how we go about it. But to give some examples of my own work or interest, in architecture being a very, static thing, basically our job is the traditional job of architecture is to fix things in place, walls primarily. In this first project, it was a challenge, and it is kind of on the meeting between an artwork and an architecture work, since it's a set design, which is kind of, sometimes you get those quick projects, relatively quick, to a building, where we were asked to design a set for a story, the story of Electra, but not only one version, but a compilation of 7 different versions. Electra is a story of a woman who convinces her brother to kill their mother since she killed their father. So, typical kind of family feud. What was interesting about this, I changed my own slides, right? It was done by a pretty experimental theater group in Israel, the team group led by a director, Rina Yerushalmi. And for the role of Electra, she chose a Jewish actor, and for the role of the brother, Orestes, was a Palestinian actor. So in a way, the whole play kind of reveals the endless cycle of blood, which doesn't have really an end, of revenge and conflict within the same family, but also constantly kind of in fighting. So being an architect, when I design buildings, I design architecture. So when we got to do a set design, we said, well, maybe it's more interesting not to do in architecture here, but to do a game of boards that are moved by the actors during the play and kind of choreographed and used as walls, as surfaces, as platforms, as screens. So some of these are mirrored boards, some of these are blank, some are red. There are about 600 of these piled up. And they're used to enact the various scenes of the tragedy, and also to capture images. So the idea of capturing an image and moving it around throughout the play became an integrated part of the project. And the challenge, of course, was not only to make this work, which the director worked a lot on and we worked on together, but how do you plan this? How do you write it down, right? You see, it kind of starts and ends with this condition. So the moving of the boards, the platform in Greek mythology is a space for the chorus, is a space to enact the different kind of actions, etc. So a lot of rehearsals was also an annotation system that kind of followed the exact dimensions of the stage, which was already made up by elements that were moving. So again, as a designer, who deals with buildings, it was very fortunate to deal here with moving pieces. And all the kind of sets were translated into different material conditions of the theater, right? So this idea of a fixed element or repetitive element that is in motion or seems to be in motion was replaced by the visitor actively moving through a space, like in this design from museum in Ashdod, which in this case, we got a shell of a building, a pyramid, a glass pyramid, which they thought is a good enough reason to have a museum. But inside it was really designed as a shopping center. And working off this a story of 2 different galleries, the traditional 19th century gallery and the white cube. And can we use these 2 forms to create a space where the movement of the visitor creates or curates kind of a show? And so imagining, for example, a bunch of these galleries falling into the space, carving out the existing and stacking these boxes one on top of each other, and allowing connections in and between them through these galleries. So the viewer, the visitor is constantly weaving together parts through movement of what they select to see and what they select not to see. Right? And you see how this kind of is organized around a common space in the middle. The last project I'll show is a design for a library. And here maybe we begin to touch on what we can call maybe forms of solidarity or collective forms, or the idea of what is public space, or the idea that public space is not an architectural project per se, it's a larger cultural project. And one of the things that we're trying to investigate in our collaboration is how art, storytelling, image making, design of physical spaces can help advance, create, sustain new forms of public, if you may, but new forms of collectives. And we're putting this in even a more particular context of solidarity. And we can talk a little bit about what that means and why that is important today and what we mean by pluri-economies. This project took a conventional, it's an international competition that asked for a library, for a national library for the state of Israel to be designed in Jerusalem. So more or less a conventional building program, a library. The questions that arise here are, well, what does it mean to do a library in the 21st century when information is changing, where the physical, spatial place of information is changing? It's no longer contained, but it's kind of everywhere. And that also hits on the relation between knowledge and public, right? Who has access to knowledge, who has access to institutions that hold knowledge, and more so is the library an opportunity to imagine a new kind of public space, right? And who is that space for? So first, in the bigger kind of sequence of thoughts, right? What are the devices that we communicate with? What are the devices that hold knowledge within? I say hold knowledge, but I would kind of correct myself. None of these devices really hold knowledge. They communicate information. The tablet, the Babylonian clay tablet, was basically a receipt. You know, this is how writing started, to document what I give you and what you owe me. And this tablet is not in any way knowledge, it's just information, data. And they're very different, 4,000 years of technology apart, but very similar in their form, right? This form, our hands has not changed, and we used our hands to hold that, and they even named the same as tablet. So there are similarities to say that architecture, as much as we want it to be somewhat innovative, falls into a very rudimentary or basic place that relates to the human body. Add to that the context of a very contested and conflicted city like Jerusalem, where territories are fought after, and boundaries and segregations and barriers and walls divide up every part of the city, which is a political reality, again, and not only through physical walls, but also through whole neighborhoods that act as walls. So in a city filled with separation and segregation, how does an architectural project begin to symbolize a different position? And here in an area which is kind of the government district where the project is to be located, the idea was not to create any walls, but to create a ground that splits into two and translated into an architectural section, has an interior and exterior, but has surfaces. Seamless space that one could walk through between various parts of this building, between various elements, where the key tectonics of it is a set of steps, again, designed for human movement, steps inside, steps outside, steps on the roof, steps in the interior, where the vertical up-down connection becomes prominent as light coming from above, and the ability to walk on top, right, gets translated into the design of the spaces. And so this movement is organized in around four courtyards, and each courtyard has different degrees of public access, one that's open throughout. Can they see my hand? No. Okay, all right. So I need to, well, you see it in the colors I'll describe. The first courtyard open 24/7 in blue. The one in gray is devoted to cultural and exhibition events, so anyone within the time that the building is open can access, so it's not even a library. The traditional library only starts in the orange courtyard, way back, kind of where the reading room is, and that you would need a card to, and then you have the green courtyard on the side that's devoted to music. So the single institution of a library becomes a series of public spaces, right, that are accessed, can be accessed by the public to different degrees. So it becomes really a space of meeting inside and again outside. So everything is kind of doubled. You see how it works in the plan. On the one hand is a single open space, but through the cross sections, more intimate spaces are organized around these courtyards. So this kind of thinking in architecture or in architecture forms and experience with, we can dare say, maybe a social agenda, leads us to our next project. You want to swap
switch,
again?
yeah.
And just to say, this is a collaboration from day one, this one.
Yep.
Right.
So, okay, to understand Care House, it's
House, yeah, let's say that.
it's helpful to know some of the context. So by 2030, we have this massive looming care crisis or care opportunity in the United States, sometimes referred to as the elder boom or the silver tsunami. And the number of people who are providing care, either paid and unpaid, does not meet the needs of those who will need care. And some of the challenges among the caregiving industry is that it is, they receive low wages caregivers, which are 90% women, 60% are women of color, people of color. They typically receive low wages and there's high job turnover in this industry. And this is one of the chief challenges. So that economic precarity translates to 60% of caregivers struggle to feed their own families and put bread on their own tables. And the toll of isolation for both is really critical because in the United States, we have this, housing typology of the nuclear family home, and caregivers are going into the privacy or the isolation of an individual home. At the same time, those who need care, they suffer, their health degrades as they become more and more isolated and as they decrease in mobility. So we have this question about how can we improve upon the social determinants of health, or how can we use and leverage design and co-living and clustered care to improve and tackle some of those key challenges. So for context, for the past 10 years, I have been working with the National Domestic Workers Alliance, which is an alliance of 10,000 nannies, housekeepers, and caregivers, who are both changing laws state by state, and also to shift how we value care. So we have produced a number of projects, including an audio novella app, which Open Doc Lab was really integrally involved with and helped to nurture and incubate from the get-go 8 years ago, to different kinds of interactive works, to this is our mobile studio, which we created in order to meet domestic workers where they're at. So I traveled in the NannyVan with my then baby, as well as a media maker and different advocates. So we'd team up and we would both convene people in public spaces to do resource and story sharing. So when I say that we're convening in these spaces, we're both the kinds of spaces that we would meet, for example, is, toddler storytime hour at the public library, to a public park, to a market, to transit stops, and so forth. And we're both always hearing the issues that people are facing, and we're also always coming up with different kinds of works. And a key thing here is for people to identify as a domestic employer or a nanny. So the kinds of things that we hear are, for example, well, I've been working as a nanny for the past 15 years, and I've never proudly identified as a domestic worker or someone who is entitled to basic rights until I saw the NannyVan and met you people. So when the NannyVan, which was born from 7 junkyards, went kaput, then we created a new mobile studio called the CareForce One. And we traveled to the south where there's the least protections for domestic workers. And essentially what we're doing is learning about solutions to the care crisis as I've encountered my own, and as 40 million Americans across the United States have also encountered care crises with their young and the old and the disabled family members. So these are some of the women who have informed both my personal journey as well as the works, and they've been involved as co-designers. So, I mean, what's really interesting about care is that it's really central to all of our lives, and yet it is something that we don't properly have. We're just starting to wake up, and we're just starting to develop new ways of talking about this issue. Here, I want to share with you this iceberg diagram by political economist J.J. Gibson Graham. And here at the top of the iceberg is what they point out when we are talking about, usually when we're talking about the economy, it's really dominated by this conversation and discourse about capitalism. And yet there are all these other kinds of essential, mutualistic, or different kinds of exchanges, from the nonprofit world to bartering to care shares and so forth. So there's this whole other vast myriad of economies and economization, to use Koray Kaliskan's word, all these other kinds of exchanges that reaffirm or affirm different ways of being. And in this chart, which is meant to be read as columns, not as rows, they point out, okay, well, even if you just take something as simple as childcare, there's this whole really elaborate network of ways in which we care for each other. And so, in our work around Care House and my work with the CareForce, part of it's, how do we elevate and make visible, and what does it mean for, what does it mean to publicly, architecturally value care on a civic and architectural level? So, this term that we've been developing, the Pluri-Economies, refers to this totality of economic structures and their interdependence.
Yeah, sure. I mean, maybe.
Do you want to drive, or you want me to just?
Yeah, you can. I can stay
Okay.
here. Right. Maybe start with the next one,
Okay.
and then we go back to this. No. Yeah. So what is Care House, and how does it work? Basically, it's what we've been calling a care-based co-housing model. It's a new kind of model where elders and caregivers live in the same building. Each has their own unit, and they have areas in which they share. So basically allowing clustered care to take place, that caregivers can support each other while they provide care to elders. And the way that it works is the elders pay into the house pays salaries for the caregivers get subsidized housing in that same building, and also a way to earn equity, and that relates to high job turnover, et cetera, et cetera. But in order to do that, designing a great building, or, as I'm speaking now as a designer of buildings, that has shared space, or to say, oh, caregivers will live here, others will live here, they meet here, they cook together, so forth, that won't do it, right? The point is that it has to be a collaborative project, not only between design and the whole process of story building and image creation and bringing a group together and helping them form an identity around this, but also in terms of development, finding the right people first, but also structures to develop this. So our team the core team is the three of us, and in this case, we are creating Care House, but we are also, I wouldn't say owning it, but in a way, managing a company, a group that acts as a kind of innovator or
Yeah.
Sort of, right. I never used that before, but well, we are at MIT, so what the heck. To make this happen. And Care House really then is able to address all these issues and bring it into the project on so many levels, right? Not only through the process of making, but also through actual art. Serving more than just storytelling and image making, but serving, and we'll talk about that, addressing low vision and memory loss and other health issues, right? And then also having a stronger impact on the city, on the neighborhood.
It should be pointed out that with a lot of, within the spectrum of senior care facilities, they're for the most part designed with the quote client, i.e. those who need care, older people who need care, who are also, you know, disabled older people, or who we all have a disability at least, you know, once in our life. So with that in mind, and they're not necessarily designed for the needs of the caregivers, we're designing for co-living space, which we didn't mention, where it's intergenerational care for the older disabled adults, as well as caregivers and their families, because that's a key challenge. New York City, where I live, the average commute time is 45 minutes. They, you know, caregivers work on average between 40 and 60 hours a week. There's very, you know, we hear all these times this heartbreaking stories about caregivers who are leaving their own kids at home unattended to go care for other people's kids. And this is a chief challenge. So what does it mean to do intergenerational care? And then also, you know, what does it mean for art and storytelling to insist that it is a right and should be accessible and it's integral to a sense of well-being?
Right. So the site is in a neighborhood called Johnson Square in East Baltimore, where we purchased 4 row houses, abandoned row houses, took them down, and are replacing them with a 5-story multifamily building of 21 units, 17 for elders and 16 or so for elders and 4 or 5 for caregivers. And the building occupies the corner and is organized in a way that in the center across its different floors are the shared spaces. We can move to, right, you see in section here. Let's move to the plans. So in pink marks the shared areas. So the units are organized like clustered around the central space that climbs up across the 5 floors. This is the ground level. Next, this is the 3rd floor, and you can see kind of the terraces below as it's kind of steps up. This is the next 5th floor, right? And so each floor gets a certain shared program or is designed for a certain collective program. Next. And they're all connected through stairs, interior stair and exterior stair that connects between the shared areas. Then one component of your work comes in.
So if you've been in a senior care facility, many are designed with a very institutional feel. And so, which also contributes to people's sense of disorientation. So, you know, we're asking this question of how can the design of the interior function as what's referred to as memory boxing or wayfinding and create a sense of identity, but we're also really specifically interested in narrating and commemorating, historicizing specific moments. So for example, so this is an exhibition at the Blackford Museum in Houston in which we transposed the common space, the first 2 floors of Care House Baltimore. And on the bottom floor, which is the shared common space, I was thinking through Clarice Castor, who was a Haitian American immigrant who came to the United States, and she is the kind of person, she had 3.5 jobs. She was a domestic worker herself. She worked at the Howard Johnson. She did a number of informal jobs. She took care of people's kids. She saved her money in her mattress to be able to loan to other Haitian Americans because as Black immigrants, there was 2 strikes and you couldn't get a loan for the things you wanted to get a loan for. And she would make extra sandwiches. Her kitchen was always open. She would give the sandwiches to the Haitian American, the sanitation drivers. So she really embodies in that film that we showed at the very onset in Venice. There was a political economist, Jessica Nembhard-Gordon, who talks about the role of Black women in the solidarity movement and being really critical anchors, that in a way that Clarice really embodies this idea. And so the lion that you see here in this mural, the lioness is a symbol of family pride, and here in her case is extended family pride to the immigrant community that she helped anchor. The tulip is, which we see in a lot of wallpaper and kind of interior decoration motifs, is a symbol of love, and it originates from Uzbekistan. This particular motif, and then went to to Amsterdam and Europe, and then the New World. So it's very diasporic in the way that the movement for domestic workers' rights is diasporic. And on the top, the theme is voice. So here, this woman who you have right here is Billie Holiday, who, as we know, she came from Baltimore. She's a singer, and she cleaned houses before she her career was realized, and her mother was a domestic worker. And these are some of the women who we met earlier in the CareForce project, who've really been critical in informing and shaping this particular project. There's June Barrett there. So yeah, how do we shift ideas and how we value care through architecture, through images, and through film? This is a co-design session in which we are involving an array of stakeholders, from local residents to doctors and physicians to telehealth experts to et cetera, et cetera. And this character will meet shortly too, the Reverend. So this tradition, screen painting is a tradition that first started in Baltimore in 1912. And it was created as a way by this guy who owned a grocery store in these row houses, and he wanted to provide some privacy, but at the same time, there's this need and interest to be able to see out. So this idea of the screen, but it's permeable and allows you to negotiate your relationship to the street. And still today, it's this tradition, and people, paint these kind of vernacular scenes of, English Tudor landscape to, religious imagery to, Baltimore waterfront scenes and so forth. So it's this screen of self-projection outward, as much as it is enabling also this conversation with the street. And with Care House, so what was interesting was, when we were talking with different stakeholders about what role can Care House fulfill, everybody keep on saying, well, we really need to light the corner because there's a lot of activity that takes place on the corner. There's a lot of drug activity. There's a liquor store that is now closed. And everyone just wants to light the street. And so everyone's like, well, we want a screen. The thing about current technology about screens and integrating that into an architectural facade, it's still very boxy. It's a high maintenance cost. There's light pollution. There's all kinds of reasons why that make it really tricky. So we're rethinking, well, what does it mean to light the street? And, people are saying, well, we want people on the street, like we want older and younger people on the street, and we want them to be close to the Care House corner. So what does it mean to draw someone in and draw the viewer in closer? And here's this idea of, again, of the body moving closer towards space and gaining intimacy. I started playing around with these, this idea of the mesh and this perforation. This is a cardboard box I essentially spray painted the inside of and was lighting it up with LED lights with my son. And it's this idea of creating this perforated mesh that's lit so that it kind of glows and you're drawn towards it, and it lights up the street. And so this is the facade of Care House, but extended. This is the black and white illustration that will then, a version of that will be rendered into mesh with these kind of light behind and kind of functioning as this glowing screen that invites you in. This motif is the Maryland state flower is a black-eyed Susan. And the acanthus is, which we also see all the time in these motifs, right? But it's a symbol of longevity. I think in closing, we're going to share with you a few works in progress, these snippets of what we're provisionally calling mesh work, and this idea of the body negotiating the screen. Before sharing with you those clips, I want to point out this tradition in Baltimore and other cities. We're still learning about this history of these cleanup clubs. And this in Baltimore, in the absence or the failure of a mid-century sanitation system, residents got together and they would clean up their streets. So I've been interviewing older residents in Baltimore and in particular around this neighborhood, and they remember this moment. It was a really formative experience of getting together and cleaning up their facade in the block, and they would push the dirt three doors down, and then someone else would push it. And there was these kind of competitions in the summer to see who would have the cleanest stoop. And it was this whole thing. And so it's not only the reward of having your stoop clean and that kind of pride, but it's also the practice of coming together and this network and this mesh that's formed that creates a sense of solidarity. There's really long lasting and kind of fascinating because you see people really doing that now, and it's just naturalized as this. This is an installation that we're working on in this snippet. So in this installation that we're working on, you enter and you are seeing these snippets in the way that, when you are arriving into a new space or entering or getting to know a new network, a group of people, there's a lot of sense making involved, and you don't understand the pathways and these nodes and connections. You're kind of still making sense. So you're introduced to these different characters that you then hear from and gain greater intimacy with. So that's Inez and Jeanette.
Sometimes that graffiti gang activity, they want you to identify their territory, so they put their gang, came out in Biddle. They put them up there, and then you try to wait to call, the graffiti number 311 and see if they'll come out and clean it. Hey, praise the Lord. What's up, guys? Get it from Family Dollar, you drill a little hole, you put the Avengers characters, and you put a little windmill. Kids love it, and it holds their eyes for a while. Get them to look at better things than the negative stuff. It holds their eyes.
So in the installation then, you gain greater intimacy, and then you stop seeing and you only hear. In this vignette, so a lot of the characters, they're always out engaging, they're sitting on the stoops, they're sitting on the street, they're actively maintaining. With the Reverend Mike Silver, these are these stumps that he created. And so when he's saying that, you know, to hold the eyes of these kids, it's like he talks about in some of the audio about this, there's a lot of drug activity and drug trafficking that takes place, and you're supposed to not see, but you do see. And he says that, you know, the way that you overcome it is you just have to start building and doing, and it's a way to step around and change this condition of invisibility and make things visible. So the stumps is like this wacky, to me, this like kind of beautiful, wacky thing that, you know, he's like creating to bring people, and it's, you know, doing similar things that are in tandem with what we are doing.
Great. No, yeah. Yeah, maybe we can take some questions.
Thank you so much. I guess I should be looking at the camera, but you're here, so this is a little awkward. Anyway, fascinating discussion in ways that you just don't think about how much, you know, the spaces and the way you can play with them and create solidarity and bring people together, and just the ways you're breaking patterns. Do we have any questions here from David?
Yeah, I have a question about CareHouse. Have you worked with anybody who's doing an economic model? Because I have a gut feeling that the CareHouse model is going to be radically more affordable than our current system of elder care. I mean, there's clearly all the intangible value of improving neighborhoods and all of that, but I have a hunch that it's also one can make a very strong economic argument, since that seems to be the only kind of argument we can make in our current capitalist economy.
That's a fantastic question. And, you know, we've spent like a year doing the economic modeling. We also have one of our advisors, Ellen Iskovitz, comes from the intersection between healthcare and finance. And so, yeah, I mean, I think an interesting challenge is, on the one hand, demonstrating the ways in which it is commensurate and more efficient. And on the other hand, that trap is, you know, not value, you know, that rubric is not always values driven and does not assess other externalities. So how we capture that is another kind of new vocabulary to forge.
But the intangibles are incredible. Right. How do you incorporate that?
Oh, what's invisible?
Hi, thanks for the talk and also for the extensive background for both of your work. I also have a question about CareHouse. And I guess I'm really wondering about this idea that CareHouse is kind of in opposition to the way that traditional caregiving facilities are built primarily for the clients who are purchasing a service, but not for the workers, the staff. Because the first thing that I did think of when I realized that CareHouse would be a place where the workers would also live is, well, the history of, you know, live-in servants, for instance, and upstairs, downstairs. So I guess I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about how you're thinking about labor exploitation, like being 24 hours on the job. For instance, another thing that's been common right during the pandemic is with the absence of commuting times, employers demanding that staff work the times that they would have been commuting. So, you know, not commuting by itself doesn't actually mean fewer working hours. In fact, means that it takes up even more time.
So, so there's two parts of your question that are worth teasing out. One is, so there's one of the key challenges for caregivers is when you're working in isolation and you're asked to do, like, for example, one of the key ergonomic challenges is lifting a heavy client out of bed or out of bathtub, or for example, and you really need another person, if not like a mechanical lift, for example, but some things cannot be kind of mechanized, right? You need the other person, or also to deal with emotional exhaustion with high needs clients, right? So someone who has memory loss or dementia, then it's really important to get your break and be able to tag team that. So one of the key things that we're trying to hone in on is making sure that there's enough padding or tolerance so that there's it's not one person working in isolation around the clock, but there's people taking shifts. And the question about the privacy and maintaining the privacy of caregivers is translate. So we involved caregivers very, very much so in creating, the architectural, informing the actual diagram and layout and so forth, with privacy in mind. And, we are asking, would caregivers want their own floor? Actually, it turns out that of the many caregivers we involved, half would want to be close to the people that they're caring for, and half would want to be on their own floor with their kids. Yeah, I mean, they're with their kids, but half would want their own dedicated floor. So, and that also translates to like separation, acoustical separation, and how it's litigated in courts, for example. But so we're very much thinking about with that in mind.
I can add to explain. In care house, actually, the larger units are going to the caregivers in order to have their families be there. And the shared spaces are primarily managed by the caregivers. So that's extra amenities in a building that you get, like a larger kitchen, a lounge, game area, a gym, So it really is improving the livelihood of caregivers, allowing them to form their community within the building. They're also, when they work as caregivers, they get paid, and there is an equity component in this equation as well to encourage them to stay, and getting subsidized rent. So it is a shift in thinking of, well, let's create a space for caregivers and make sure the caregivers are also living a healthier life in order for also the elders to live a healthier life, because the two are really intrinsically tied and we can't separate them. So it is a residential building, what we call a co-living, co-housing model for these two groups that have an interest to be together. And we haven't even touched upon the whole component of child and the interaction of children with the elders, how important that is for elders, but how great that is also for children. So the many other social, or in the big kind of umbrella of the social determinants of health, that Care House is beginning to create kind of the spaces for.
Hi, thank you for being here. I kind of actually have a similar follow-up question to what Abby was talking about. You mentioned kind of making the invisible labor visible. You talked about this idea of visibility, right? But a lot of the politics of visibility are complicated when the identity of a lot of the caregivers may not be open for visibility, legal status, or how, their families are, like, there's so many implications to visibility. So I'm wondering how you're planning to sort of navigate that, because every caregiver has their own unique story, their family dynamics are different. So a blanket idea of like bringing, the family, that's bringing like a whole idea of what's safe, what's not. So it's a two-part question kind of, but I'm just wondering if those are things you've thought about or how you've had those conversations.
Yeah. So we're actually writing we're working on a book right now, and there's a whole chapter dedicated to that specifically. And I think the CareForce, so with the CareForce project, there's both, definitely it's about negotiating strategies of visibility and visibility. So for example, after Trump was elected, I was doing a project. We were doing a CareForce project in at the Betty's Art Museum in Miami. And I should say that whenever I'm working with groups, I am always very mindful about, you know, there is this opportunity at this museum. Is this even worth your time? Is this of interest? And if so, like, I'm curious about how it's of relevance. And I was told, actually, the Miami Worker Center, they were really interested in passing a citywide domestic worker bill of rights. And they said, you know, actually, we really need key allies who are domestic employers. We are really interested. And so we planned this whole event, and we, you know, figure out our talking points, and they, you know, they invite legislators to kind of, it's used as a way to bring visibility to this legislative moment. Then, and the plan was that we were going to do what we call this CareForce Disco, in which it feels like Zumba, but we're narrating the history of the domestic worker movement and so forth. And we adjust the dance every time according to the group and the issues. So Trump was elected, and we met with the domestic workers, the Worker Center, and, you know, they were sharing their experiences that they felt afraid to even just walk down the street. So, but for them, they very much still, so the meeting was like, we should probably cancel it. And it was like, no, but the workers had said, actually, it's really important because they wanted to be able to insist on the right as undocumented Caribbean and Latinx women to be on the street and to occupy space in a group and perform. So, and then we had the CareForce One there. So it was like a way of temporary claiming space. So, you know, when we're talking about, we're interested in different, I mean, in our joint work, we're interested in spatial practices, whether that's capital A architecture, that's infrastructure and capital intensive, or whether that's performative pop-up that is necessarily something that can be broken down, rendered invisible. But for that moment, you're creating these spaces of mutual exchange of story sharing and public visibility. That can be mediagenic. That's useful.
Just to add, there's a difference between visibility of the individual and the group. And in order to participate in a democratic society, a group needs visibility.
Yeah. All right. So there's a question here that I'm going to read to you from Edward Morris. He's interested in hearing more about how the Zizek notion of believing as if is embodied in the care house design and plan.
You brought that up.
Hi, Ed. Is an old friend. So, I mean, I think to me, it's about belief structures. I mean, the Zizek is bringing on this. I mean, there's other people who are talking about believing as if, like John Searle, the linguist, talks about it, and this idea of creating institutions which we know we are creating and we believe as if. Zizek's notion is about, you know, he's in the essay that he's talking about, mapping ideology, he's talking about religion, which is a similar kind of belief structure. I mean, I think we, for the most part, in the United States, we have not made visible, we have not made public discursively care, this whole other kind of vast world on which, you know, the GDP exists, in which wellness exists and families' sanity exists. And so if we understand, it's just this idea that we can shift belief structures to include a world in which we're including that as part of the way in which we're valuing and making things public.
You know, we've been doing a lot of work here about design disability, design justice, and I'm curious, you know, how that's playing out there. I mean, you have all your colors and different wayfinding and things like that, but you also talked about steps everywhere. So how, only one project. So not in this one, it doesn't have steps in the care house.
Not only doesn't have steps, but actually there are no corridors in care house. And there are multiple entrances and exits, and every floor has open space, and every unit has a kind of balcony almost condition of a large window that is open. So, and it has an in and out for pandemic situations. So the whole building is designed around issues, and it has ADA units, and all the doors are ADA accessible, and it has a stretcher capable, elevator, and it's all in a very small building. It's really a very small building that is kind of the size of a few row houses. So all that kind of came into the design specifically for elders and disabled people.
And it's designed more, so ADA really is for any disability advocates would say that ADA is the bare minimum. And universal design is sometimes used as a set of principles to refer to a broader set that goes beyond. And so our care house is situated in universal design, but we're, still too, there's a untapped potential to design for and bring together different innovations in how you design for people with low visibility or low hearing, which we're incorporating and taking into consideration. And I say that as someone who we have a history of very poor eyesight, and I actually have really, really bad eyesight. And if I don't have my contacts in, it's a very scary world. I can't see anything, and I need like my phone, and my phone is in red, my backpack is in red, my wallet's in red, because otherwise I feel really uncertain. So there's very wayfinding devices that we're incorporating.
Any other questions?
Quick question, or I'd like you to speak a little bit more, if you could, about kind of your relationship to optical media and historical optical media. I find that the screen paintings in Baltimore seem to be really how you're trying to kind of approach your relationship to media, somehow interior and exterior, sort of, projecting, but also, I mean, that whole kind of dynamic. And I'm wondering if you could just speak a little bit more about how, in your transmedia practice, you kind of negotiate, our experience of media differently and our experience of the world through media differently.
I love that question also because for me, it's an unresolved question that find myself exploring, and then I make a work and I'm like, oh, that's still probing at that question. And I mean, I think for years I was really not thinking about this idea of mesh until we encountered these examples of the screen painting in my work, and also in the kind of chapter in which I'm writing about visibility, is also this notion of porosity, which for me has been a way of thinking through how I collaborate with people. And I see myself as an art maker that creates structures for other people to join in. It's like I'm driving the bus, but someone, different people get on and off the bus, or it's something that people, like with the Bibliobandido project, it's a set of rough beliefs, and then people can invent their own characters. And so I think the mesh is a new maybe leitmotif for thinking through this idea of participation and porosity.
Maybe more than a screen, since it's always double-sided. The screen could be interpreted as a single kind of the porous surface that has two sides to it. Always the mesh. There's an inside and an outside. There's always that interaction.
Oh, back projection then. I mean, screens are not.
Right. But but spaces, occupied spaces. Right.
I appreciate that you're not just projecting onto walls, but you're really thinking about that tension.
Because of day and night, if we take it into the street state, there is a common problem of what you do on the ground level. If it's not a shop, it's not retail. I mean, just having people live there, so it's closed, but if you want it a bit open and you have some communal activity, and it becomes too open, right? So how do you, just as an urban problem, in the case here, where we have a collective space of dining for the elders and caregivers, ground level, you want to have the porosity, you want to be able to look outside, but you want to be too exposed. So how do you create a presence on the screen, but also maintain some privacy, but at the same time, change between night and day and bring in other more power and symbolism and storytelling into from the building outward and from the street inward.
And how that can help you create new forms of publicness.
Exactly. So like Marisa is saying, negotiating those spaces through the mesh or the double-sided screen or whatever we end up calling it. It is really this fantastic kind of project to take on, which is architecture and an architecture and an artistic project at the same time. That's a nice ending.
I think that's a wonderful ending. Thank you so much. That's fascinating and a wonderful, wonderful project. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Please join us next week for a talk by Michael Saitao, founder and CEO of Potions and Pixels. Thank you.